Okay. Aloha nui kako. I guess we all need a little bit of energy and liveliness at this hour. Oneia kapalua hola. Eva, 9:30 p.m. So we did Hui Aloha Aina o Wahine, because our group is what you call was infiltrated by a feminist who lives far down south. Um, and I'm going to let her explain some of her interest and rationale as to the Hui Aloha Aino na Wahine, but um, our presentation is kind of just, well, we'll get into it, but I'll let Hina talk first.
Okay, so I think the thing that got me super interested in this hui, aside from the fact that they're just interesting and amazing to me, um, was several years ago. I do this crazy thing every single February, which I'm in the middle of right now, is publishing some kind of piece of content every single day for Hawaiian Language Month. I'm over it. I'm not doing it next year. Goodbye. Um, but I did a week on the Hui Aloha Aino na Wahine, and I was just fascinated by the articles that I found, and I was kind of fumbling around by myself, and Kumu helped me with a few, but I just wanted to know more, and I went into it thinking there's going to be all this cool stuff because I had found already like a bunch of cool things, and I'm sorry to say that, like, for me, I was just wishing that there was more. Like, never before in an Ohina had I felt so like on the outside of a conversation, or that there was like a national, many conversations happening about stuff at this time, and we only got little windows into what the Hui was doing at different times. The players are kind of known, but what they get up to in big chunks of between like 18, between when they start and when the petitions start up, there's not a ton of stuff, and I kind of was really wishing that we would see more. And then I broke it up so that we would each get stuff from each time era, because in when we did prior Ohina, there was like a lot of juicy stuff up front and not so much in the back. So I thought, oh, I'll break it up so that we all get a little bit out of each kind of decade or whatever. But then that turned out to sort of make it confusing. So in the end, we kind of rearranged it by time. And then when I went back through, I thought, wow, actually, we really did. There was some neat stuff. It just wasn't as much as I was hoping. So anyway, they're an amazing set of ladies. Pili, Kainoa, anything else you want to open with?
Um, Not so much the opening, but we just wanted to start off with at least the faces of the board, or what would eventually be the main board that became famed and known later on, because the initial board kind of resigned after a internal dispute within the women that we'll talk about in a little bit. But um, yeah, these are kind of the leaders and movers and shakers of the Hui Aloha Aina that kind of was able to organize, but also caused a little bit of tension amongst various chapters on other islands. Um, just because any group, it's hard to get a unanimous decision, and especially when there's that many people. So the the history of the Hui Aloha Aina o Wahine is not a long history, um, but it's kind of interesting and extends farther than we probably think. Not directly, but um, they continue to have influence long after the association itself kind of dissolves. Um, so again, just like everybody else, just repeating, but wanting to document it in the presentation because of our current situation. We're kind of restricted to Papakilo and the Hawaiian language newspapers that was the main source of our material. There's a few other pieces. Auntie sent us a letter um, that she found when she went over to DC the other year. Um, but besides that and a few other pieces, the vast majority of our database is solely newspaper articles. Um, so I think I did my math correctly, probably not, but there's a total, we did 196.25 pages of transcribed and translated text, um, equaling 106 individual articles. Like Hina said, it was a bit difficult there wasn't as much as we probably intended there to be. Um, And so the the articles of substance that we ended up keeping in our ohina totaled only at 204. And we also noticed these like spikes in when the Hui Aloha Aina o Wahine was really active, and that was kind of in the beginning in '93 and early '94, um, shortly following the overthrow, and then '95, '96, and most of '97, it's kind of really, really quiet. At least in the newspapers, I'm sure there's a lot of activity occurring um, and community organizing that's happening. And then they pick up again when um, John, Kaliko, and Aulani, then when they have the Huakaihelea Lili Uokalani during that time and their efforts to stop the second attempt at the treaty annexation. And so basically what how we organized our presentation is just going through and picking out some of the highlights from each of the years. Um, we didn't want it to be a super lengthy presentation, but kind of able to get a good sense of what they were able to accomplish, the kinds of things that we came across. Um, because there's such few entries, a lot of the times the stories that were reported were um, echoed in a number of newspapers. So it may be the same paina that happened in Hana, but it's in Kamaka it's in Kealoha Aina, and Kanupepo Ko'oko'a. And so they each have different levels of detail and slightly different things that they include. So we chose to, even though they're about the same event, um, we chose to translate multiple articles, even though they all centered around a similar thing. Um, and so you guys all have access to this. It's in the translation folder on the Google Drive. And so we put a lot of these hyperlinks um, to what you call to these articles that talk about these things in specific. And like I said, in our Ohina, most of these bullet points that we're outlining have multiple articles attached to them, which is kind of nice because it almost is like a validation and verification of the story and the events because it's being published through multiple sources. Um, and so shortly after the overthrow is when the Hui kind of gets going already in March of '93, just 2 months after the overthrow is when we see the first, um, at least in the newspapers anyways, the first mention of the Hui Aloha Aina o Wahine specifically. And they're already kind of organizing these community meetings to call out to the women to join and start organizing. Um, and that's kind of about the same time that Blount is already here in Honolulu, um, which again is, I mean, timelines are not my strength, and we all sort of know the events, but it just was baffling to me that he was here so quickly after the overthrow, um, which was my stupid blonde aha moment through this Ohina because again back in the time pre CNN and pre airplane that was kind of a quick turnaround to get him here. But yeah, and so that's kind of really what's happening in 1893. Um, and we'll leave a lot of these links again, and it'll just open to the article
It's
talking. But the
interesting though,
women,
because oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, sorry, go Hina.
Finish what you're gonna say.
No, and so the women did it's noted multiple times over several weeks about them hosting Commissioner Blount, spending time with him and his wife, um, and them kind of just um, amazing them at um, their demeanor, their intelligence, um, their like savviness in those circles, and being able to what's the word I'm looking for?
Launa with these people from overseas.
Yeah.
Yeah, they really like so when Commissioner Blount and his wife showed up, like the Hui Aloha Aina ladies were kind of in charge of hosting them, and they hosted them in Honolulu and in Hilo. And they kind of, I mean, they gathered obviously to have serious political talks, but they also took them on canoe rides, and they took them, to see all sorts of things, and cliff jumping and this and that. And so you can tell that they were really trying to like give them a feel for Hawaii, not just the political landscape, but who those people of the time were as Hawaiians. And they sent them away with gifts, and you just got this feeling that they were putting a lot of their hopes in these meetings that they had with them and the outcomes that his reports might have. On the next slide the one with the roadblock stuff, Pili?
Uh, I believe so.
Oh, just one of the interesting things that I wanted to touch on in oh, it comes after this. That's okay.
Oh.
So yeah, so Pili mentioned the fracture that happened in the Hui early on. And that was because when they were making their memoriala, or the official sort of statement of what they thought and what they wanted to turn into Blount, they there was a difference of opinion in language, and one part of the Hui wanted it to say Lili Uokalani will be restored to the throne, and another section of the Hui was like, that's not what we want. And so there was this huge division of opinion that must, in looking at that, in looking back at that, must kind of reflect sort of a little bit of what was happening in the community at the time, because I think there were some people in the community that were staunch royalists, where others were kind of questioning Lili Okalani's ability to lead, and whether they still wanted to be, mahopeona. And so I feel like the fracture in the Hui kind of talks a little bit about, what's also happening at the wider community level. And so the first, the first head president is in the "No, we don't want Liliu's name" in the Memoriala camp, her and the Hope president, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so they end up leaving, and that's when Kuaihelani steps in, who is
But yeah, just to clarify the point that Hina was making on that, um, everyone was in consensus that they wanted to maintain um, a monarchy, but they wanted a sovereign to be returned, not necessarily Liu. And with the clarification of Liliu's name in the memorial that they were delivering to Blount, that's kind of where that tension sprouted from, which eventually caused the original, um, like, not board of directors, but executive board, whatever, to kind of resign. And that's when Kuaihelani them step in. And this is only a month after the initial founding, or less than a month after the initial founding of the association. And early on, one of the interesting ones, I encourage you folks, sorry, um, to go and read that one, um, because these women are catching a lot of flack for, wait, kalamai, for being outspoken women and being politically involved, um, and saying, like, almost critiquing their husbands, saying, how are you letting your wives go out and be this outspoken? You need to learn how to control your wife, kind of thing. And when you think about it, it's the 1890s, and so that's very much kind of the social norm of the time. But these women were, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, they were kind of the movers and shakers. They were the pre Kauisa Dudwa, before Kauisa Dudwa was born. Um, and so
well,
yeah.
and they were the ladies that had the time and the resources as well. Like, they talk about how Kuaihelani comes from, a well-to-do family in Lahaina, and a lot of the ladies are like, I don't want to say high society, but they're ladies that they have resources, they have time, and so they take their time and resources and they put it into community outreach and organizing, and they're out there like trying to spread this message and bring people on board, not just their own people but other people as well. And I think that this particular article that criticized them and said, oh, these men should be, have, be controlling their women and not letting them go out and speak like that, was really, I found that personally offensive, because we had read how the women, when they started up the Hui, one of the main intentions they said was to support the efforts that the men were doing. They didn't just do that, but they said, we're here to support what you guys were doing because the men were deep in the politics. And so they did their best to back them and everything that was needed on that side. But when they weren't doing that, they were doing all kinds of other stuff out in their communities, which is kind of coming up on the next couple of slides.
And then Columbine, we're not ignoring you, Pani. We just didn't see it yet. So the original president was McFarlane is the last name. What is her first name?
M and Emma? No.
That's
Shoot.
what's ringing in my head, Emma McFarlane, but I'm not sure if it's Emma. But McFarlane, anyways.
Okay.
Which is terrible. We should know.
Oh yeah, to kind of add to that last slide, there was a lot of tension between the Hui, and in one of the articles they published both articles. One that they said, oh, this has nothing to, this doesn't mention anything of the restoration of the sovereignty to Lili'u, and then they go on to publish the other one, the correct one that they say, oh, this is the one that we all agreed upon. And after that, they go on to say, we don't mean to put both out in the newspaper to show the divide between all of us, but really we put that out so that the general public that doesn't really know what's happening in all the politics and that's in the mix can kind of get a feel or get words of what's really happening behind the scenes. And so they say, we put this out there only for those like a maupopo ole ikahana omako. For those that don't really know what's happening, this is the truth, and they put it out there. And there's one article which is funny that goes back to a conflict of interest actually. There's a short article happens in Waihe from Mrs. Maule, who says, oh, I wrote my name down and I support patriotism, but actually I'm gonna take it off because I don't really know, and now I kind of support the whole Hui Aina me Amelika. And then so there's this whole papa between in the newspaper, and then someone else writes in penned Aloha Aina Oe I'o. They pen their name and said, how's this lady? Like she writes, oh yeah, and then after she saw, she saw the money and the silver and all the all the goods that America going to bring to us, and now she's kind of backing up and like, well, and then she goes and then she replies again and says, actually, I don't know who wrote that that article. That wasn't me, and I'll defend that to the end of my days. That I don't know who wrote that, and somebody wrote that in my name, and so you see a real divide when it comes to what people want out of Hui Aina and true patriotism, or and yeah. So it's interesting to see that dialogue and that whole papa in the newspaper, as we all seen in other articles and stuff like that. But yeah, there was much divide. And yes, Hina.
No, just on the divide thing is that too, like there's twice we see a divide over the memoriala and then later on over the delegates, like which delegates should go. And both times that we see that, there's voices from the general community writing in to say, hey, this is no time for division. We need to lokahi. And that's kind of also a consistent message that's kind of coming in on the side. And during the first division, somebody wrote in and one quote from the article that this person wrote said, if the depth of their love of the sovereign people and country is truly profound, then they need to carry on until the end of their lives. And so it's just interesting because there's some really, really staunch royalists, patriots, loyal people that are, they don't want to see, they see the division and they see the problems and they just go, no, this no can. We gotta keep forging ahead. So you guys sort out your differences and get on with it because this is their work for life. So yeah. So Homa. Oh yeah, and so sorry. Over this time too, you see, this is when we see like from now for the next 3 or 4 years, we see all kind hui popping up all over the place. And there were hui on almost every island. We see hui from Kalaupapa, many hui in Hana, many hui on Hawaii Island, in other places on Maui. There's just choke hui, hui aloha aina underneath the aha hui itself. Women's and men's, there's just lots of different branches and lots of different people that are into it. Okay, next
Uh,
one.
This
Or
is
no,
just
have some
a
more?
real
Oh, yeah.
quick, funny article that came up. It's really short, and it reads: "Oyaku kai kaika me ka hoi hoi o ka hui aloha aina na wahine Hawaii a puni ka aina I ka ho'ole I ka ho'hui aina ma mua ka na kane." And you know, it's just real short and to the point. You know, we were talking earlier saying you know, that the men are doing all the work and blah blah blah, and then this is just a short article saying, oh, you know, actually the women are way more into it than the brothers are. You know, like kind of in your face, drop the mic kind of thing. You know, like so what? What you guys gonna do about it? It's just a
That-
funny article.
It's a perfect example of how there's just these little pieces here and there scattered through time, but they hint at these bigger conversations and these other things happening that, just sort of like to be at some dinner tables hearing what people were saying. Um, and in one of the early articles in 1893, when the Hui is, I don't know, apparently they come out with a splash because they are heard about all over the world. And a bunch of Hui ladies are walking on the side of the road one day and they're all dressed up doing their thing. And these guys are on a streetcar, these travelers, and they come off the streetcar and they jump down onto the road to meet the ladies and talk to them. And they say, oh, we've heard about, your work and we think it's amazing and just keep going for the independence of your country and we support you. And when I looked up the name of the steamer that they had come in on, it was a steamer that goes between Hong Kong, San Francisco, and somewhere else in the east. And so it could have been people from any of those places. And in that same article was this little paukumele about Aloha Aina. And I don't know, I just really liked it. And so we threw it in here and it says, He wile ana pana pela ku'u Aloha Aina, mana verela o ka honua ua puni I ka lono no Hawaii. So apparently I would like to see in the English newspapers or newspapers from different places, evidence that that word of what they were doing was all over as is hinted in this article. We didn't, that was out of the scope of our work, but it would be interesting to go and look at articles from other papers at this time.
Yes, and then so continuing on, all of that is again in those first initial months that the Ahahui came into existence, and then 1894. It's pretty quiet in the newspapers. That doesn't mean that they're not doing a lot of work. However, it's just not work that's being documented in the newspapers. But in the few articles that do show up in that year, a lot of it is more about the members, because now these members of the Ahahui are become. I mean, a lot of them are already well known, like Kuaihelani and Navahi, and so it's a lot more about the members themselves or um, their ohana and family members that may have been passing, and then also they continue these community meetings. So a lot of it is small little announcements in the newspapers that there's going to be a Hui Aloha Aina meeting at such and such place, and so that's kind of the majority of the work that's happening in '94. And then when we get to '95, it seems like rather than being specifically about the political restoration of the monarchy in Hawaii, um, being that there's a lot of other issues to address here in Hawaii, the Hui Aloha Aina starts to not pivot because they're still focused on that, but branch out into other parts of the community in which that they can lend their services, and they become really this benevolent society that organizes and fundraises. Um, and the two main causes is the lepers, not only in Kalaupapa but at Kaka'ako, um, as well as the prisoners, which Kumu really helped us get through that part because we were so confused. Because it's hard to bring in context of other things that's not in your immediate viewpoint when we're thinking about the Hui Aloha Aina, but we also forgot that in 1895 was Kawa Kuloko. And so a lot of those prisoners and things were assisted through the fundraising efforts of the Ahahui Aloha Aina on Wahine.
Yeah, and there was some discussion about supporting them, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then one thing that we forgot to mention up front is some of our conventions, we followed a lot of when it comes to our translations and stuff, following the conventions set by Huili Hauma kalamai, um, when they did Kaulia and a lot of that political jargon. So um, when talking about these parties, we kept the Ino Hawaii even in the English because that was their name that they were known by. Um, and then also when it comes to the Hui Aloha Aina, they show up in multiple forms. Sometimes it's just um, Hui Aloha, like the actual title Hui Aloha Aina o Nā Wahine. Sometimes it's Aha Hui. Sometimes it's Hui Aloha Aina o Nā Lere. And at first we were very not dismissive, but we just weren't um, attuned to maybe the difference and the connotative difference of like Lere and Wahine. And so everything just kept being translated as women's. And Kumu brought up the point that, um, especially back in that time period, a lady has a certain quality that maybe a simple woman doesn't have. And so it was worth maintaining that translation of lady in the translation whenever the word lere was used in the Hawaiian, which shows us a certain level of like sophistication, of elegance and intelligence that um, not that woman doesn't, but again, lady has a different flavor, and so we were a little bit more mindful of certain words like that as we were going through our translation. Um, and then yes,
lady showed up. We kept lady.
But because they're doing such good job at fundraising and throwing all of these like benefit banquets, it seems like these ladies love to party as well. Because I feel like a third of maybe our articles are different pa'ina or luau that they were throwing to raise money. Then it becomes how should the money be spent? Um, and a lot of people agree that even though the political focus and goal of restoring the queen is important, it's very worthwhile to spend money on things like the lepers and the prisoners. And so there's a short little, there's again a couple of articles, but all of these hyperlinks are there for you folks to go and read some of those articles. And then in 96, again, it's a little quiet again. There's still a lot of community organizing going on throughout the islands, but one of the big things that we see is the outpouring of aloha from the Hui Aloha Aina to Emma Navahi at the passing of Joseph Navahi. And there's a whole run for like months of all these different chapters writing to her. But it was really interesting because they have a certain almost format and template in which they were all penned. And so it was nice to kind of look at that and see how condolences were expressed and the kind of like formulaic language that was used in expressing, because it wasn't just Navahi. A lot of times there were like these official statements of condolence at the passing of certain people or families of the women in the Hui Aloha Aina. And again, they all had a kind of similar formula. And then here is when we start to see, sorry, I just put that in, that they take the spiritual tact. Because prior to this, there's not a lot of mention of religion. But in 1896, now we start to hear from Kuaihelani Ma encouraging these women to fast, encouraging them to beseech the Lord for his blessings and guidance and help in the matter and in achieving their goal, which was not surprising, but again, you hadn't seen it in the 3 years prior, and so it was just like kind of out of nowhere, and it was always on the last Thursday of the month where they would ho'oke'ai, or at least the announcement would go out anyways to ho'oke'ai.
And pule. Okay, let's go. So this is when we see another sort of spike in activity and articles. There we had a lot in this year because they're collecting the signatures on the petitions. They're fundraising and they're getting ready to like launch the delegates. And so, um, yeah, there's a whole bunch of action right in 1897. And you know, Kuaihelani's travels to Hawaii Island in particular were really well documented, and there were some big meetings there that she had in the community, gave speeches, and then she went around to all kinds of different chapters. And so Emma Navahi writes about, you know, their trip, and then another author also writes about kind of like how, like the process of their huaka'i and everybody that they saw, and they go up and they visit Tutupele, and they everywhere that they go on Hawaii Island, they're greeted with lei and gifts, and they're hosted lavishly, and you know they're referred to with so much aloha and respect. So that was one of the really cool things that we got to see just in her travels on Hawaii Island. And then what I didn't realize until we resorted our articles into the time flow is that at this same time is also when senators have been sent to America to like actually, you know, ask the Hawaiian people what they want and get a sort of a temperature check for where people are at. And and they did I take the piece out right? Let's see if I thought I pulled the quote, but I didn't. But this senator basically, there's two senators in the group of traveling senators, and they're all staying together. And these two senators literally sneak away from the group of the rest of the people to go and actually meet with Hawaiians. And they sit there and they ask them, you know, what do you want? They have all these specific questions. How do you feel about annexation? You know, what do you think it is that America can actually, you know, do or not do for you? What are your thoughts and feelings on everything? And then they said, you know, we were sent here with all these other people to figure out exactly what it is that Hawaiians want. And those people who are known to be good people in America all like stayed in, you know, stayed with basically non-Hawaiians, were wined and dined, went and had a bunch of fun. And those non-Hawaiians told them, it's all good. Everybody wants annexation. And now they're going to go back and tell everybody that. And it was these two senators were the only guys who actually made an effort to leave that group, according to this article. They were the only guys who made an effort to actually leave the group and meet with Hawaiians to figure out, you know, what like the poe oiwi, what their feelings and desires were. And so that those were really, there were two articles about that were really fascinating. And I didn't realize that, you know, because when we looked in the English papers, we saw some documentation of senators traveling, but all the only opinions that we saw happening there were that Hawaii's pro-annexation. And then when we were looked in the Hawaiian language newspapers, it was, you know, two articles about two guys who had to literally like sneak out of their hotel to go and meet with actual Hawaiian people, you know, like poe oiwi, to see what they want, and not just meet with non-Hawaiians who are telling them, yeah, we want annexation. And then the third big thing in that year is the big fundraising feast that they have in Honolulu for the delegates, which has all kinds of stuff. Go, Pili.
Yeah, but leading into that, there is another big discussion as to how many should they be sending, how many can they afford to send, who should they be sending. And the Hui Aloha Aina o Nakane want 5, and the women are like, no, 2 people and a secretary is what we can afford to send.
And we really want to send the guys we trust. It's kind of were like, oh, we don't trust some of the other people, so we don't want them to go.
And the men were actually outvoted, and that's eventually what gets chosen. I think it's Kaulia, Kalaukalani, and Keoka'aka, I think, are the 3 that get sent, and Keoka'aka is supposed to be the secretary. And there's other people who meet up with them later, but I guess those are the people, according to the articles that we translated, are the ones that are funded through the Hui Aloha Aina and the monies that they raise to go. But even the people who were being sent, it was kind of a heated debate, and the women kind of pulled out for a bit because the men were being stubborn as to who they felt should be the 3 that were going to get sent. So that was kind of a nice, fun little run of articles in 1897. And again, this is one of them. because we translated them all for you, so go read them. Okay. Oh wait, we went backwards. What happened? Oh,
Yeah, so in 1897, we see a lot of these fundraising luau. And basically, they were the hui in Hana, who I mentioned last time, they had a lot of different hui aloha aina in Hana alone, or in the east side, 3 for the men and 3 for the women. And they took it upon themselves to collect money from those people in the districts to support the delegates that were to be sent. You know, they weren't gonna wait for anyone else to give them money. They weren't just gonna wait around and say, oh, you know, they need money and blah 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 blah. And they said, you know, we have to do it ourselves. We cannot wait. Why we wait too long? Yeah, and so they held a feast, and so those from Huiki, Hana, Waianapanapa, and Kipahulu, they all came together and they had this big feast, and people were speaking about Hui Aloha Aina and patriotism and why we really need to support the people that we're sending, that they are the ones that are our voice and are the ones that without them, nobody's really going to hear us. Yeah. And so there was $40 collected that night and everybody had a giant feast and it was cool. And yeah, everybody ate full, and it says that, you know, there was so much people that you couldn't count the people. And then at the end of the article, it says that at the following all the le'a, all the po'o got together again and said, oh, so how are we gonna divide this money up, you know? And they say, and they go on to say that each hui had agreed upon themselves and how much each hui would take back for themselves, and see, you know, they took it upon themselves to see how much was each group deemed fit for themselves. And that was a real testament to what I see as lokahi, because, you know, it would have been easy for them to say, oh, well, our hui brought the most money, so we should take the most money and we should do this and that with it. But um, when it comes to patriotism and love for the lahui, it really is the greater picture is how we're going to do this for the betterment of all of us. And that was really nice to see in that article. And yeah, lokahi at its finest.
And one of the things that Auntie reminded us too about why there was so much fundraising is that after the overthrow, I think the way you said it, Auntie, was that like Lilit was assets were frozen, like she didn't have access to her vai, and so she couldn't herself fund the delegates. And so because she couldn't, you know, there was zero governmental support at all for these efforts. It was like a for the people by the people thing. And so there's several articles in the newspaper that are calling out to people on all islands from all hui, whether you're in a hui or you're not, you know, like that quarter that you got in your pocket, it might feed you for a day, but you know, your la hui really needs it. So, you know, Lulu, and let's get these guys, let's make sure the delegates are okay and continue to fund them while they're there. And so it really was like a grassroots thing that Hawaiians came together to do because that was the only way that they were going to fund it. Homa?
And then we start to see the kind of wind down of the Hui Aloha Aina after that. In 98, again, it starts to quiet down a little bit. Those same chapters in Hana that Kainoa was just talking about publishes this kind of lengthy rebuke to the Honolulu chapter. They kind of are the lead chapter of the association, rejecting the unilateral decisions that are being made here, and they felt like they're being left out of the conversations from that point on. Although we don't hear too much about any of those decisions because, again, the mention of the hui starts to die down in the newspapers after that. And even that feast, because it happens late in 97, there's some contention later on about what was donated, who donated what, and so there's a few little like loose ends that gets tied up in 98, and it seems like that's kind of the end of the functioning hui. We never get an actual end to it. But then following, um, just like everything, kind of like what HAA was talking about earlier, um, everything is a lot more nuanced than what's the word I'm looking for? Anyways, my vocabulary is failing me, but it's not as clear and it's not as black and white as we think it is. Um, and so there are some critiques later on. There's one in particular. It's quite a lengthy article, but it's not written by a woman, but a woman was interviewed for that article who was a prior member of the Hui Aloha Aina o Waiʻeha, who was very critical about the Hui Aloha Aina afterwards, saying that they were kind of just um, swindlers and that all of the money that they donated was for nothing because the queen was never restored. And I guess it's easy to have this 2020 hindsight and critique afterwards, but in the moment, everybody really was trying their best to get to that end goal. And so it was kind of one of those interesting articles to read and translate. And that was, I think, my last article that I translated. And then, well after these last two articles, this one was in 1914 and then 1918, when again the Hui Aloha Aina has long been disbanded. It seems like they still have their financial account intact. And so in 1914, there's an article about them still donating and caring for the lepers. And they make a Christmas donation, which is kind of cute and well received. And then in 1918, which is also during World War I or time, because these women seem to be such good community organizers and they displayed all of their skill and expertise in the decade before, they were called upon again to kind of help lead the organization and rallying together the people to band together their efforts because there's things like rationings of food and gathering tin and stuff like that to donate to kind of help in the war efforts. And that's kind of the last mention that we found of the Hui Aloha Aina was that article in 1918. And so these are kind of our main takeaways. Hina, if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, again, I wish that there was a lot more with more detail, but what we could see from some of the articles that we got is that you know, even though they sprang up in with the main goal of supporting the political aims of the larger Hui Aloha Aina at the time, that they really like they pulled in all these women and they were in the community doing things to help the Lahui. And even though politics was kind of like the probably main priority, it was the health and the physical well-being of people that they also really focused on, which was something that I didn't know too much about, like that um, Ahahui Hawaii Manawalea. A lot of the same ladies, like I don't know, our kupuna loved them Ahahui. They had all kind of Ahahui, and at least in that one, the Ahahui Hawaii Manawalea, there was a lot of overlap in members with the Hui Aloha Aina na Wahine. And so I think it was just kind of a neat time when they were, you know, drawing in people, drawing in support, and really trying to like be there for their community. And so that was a takeaway of mine that I didn't know before. And yeah, that was kind of the big one for me.
And then just to end, we have a few little
Oh
images
yeah,
in the museum of the actual ledgers from when they went around collecting signatures, which was interesting because, I mean, it was mentioned here and there, but it wasn't as big of a part of um, the Ohina as we thought it would have been. Um, the collection of signatures for the petitions that was sent over to Washington.
yeah. These are the roll books, and that was one of my big points of disappointment is that we didn't see like more talk about the petitions and about the signature collecting. I was hoping that we would see more about that, but we didn't. These ones are at Bishop Museum, and these are actually the rule books for each area. So like this one is from Kalapana, the first one was from Hana, and they have a whole bunch there. And they're definitely not like, I took these pictures a few years ago when I was researching them. And this is definitely not like all of the hui. They don't have the full collection at Bishop Museum, but they have several from different places in the islands. And so try to go to the last picture, Pili, please. So it's usually this 2-column thing, and they have their signature and then how old they are. And there were young women as young as like 15 and 16, and then ladies all the way into their 90s, which was kind of cool to see. So yeah, these are the membership books, and you can see these at the Bishop Museum. Oh, okay, mahalo e lihau. Yeah, oye, hola ka'u.
Ohini no mahalo. Mahui ho.
Okay. So did you guys find that, or you sound disappointed in what you were able to gather, or?
I wouldn't say disappointed, but I wanted a fuller picture. And I think, yeah. And it's one of those things where, we couldn't get into other spaces, and what's in there is what we had to work with, what's in the new Pepa. We tried a whole bunch of different permutations of their names and, search terms with Aloha Aina in it. But yeah, we didn't come up with as much as we would have liked to. Well, I didn't think anyway, but there were some neat pieces.
I just wanted to throw in that part of the thing is being limited to the newspapers. Not all of their activities were able to be publicized.
Yeah.
I translated all the letters of Aima to Lili'u. And even there, within the letters, a lot of the discussion of, we're sending up a whole of hundreds of fans. The women have woven for you, which had nothing to do with fans. They were sending up the petitions, and they were sending up dollars. But none of that was to be public discussion. So a lot of their activity, just saying that the association was in action, was a lot of the public dialogue. So a lot of the internals of it, I don't think were public discussion. When we're able to step away from COVID and play around in the archives and some of the letter collections, I think we might find a lot that could add to this. But this provided a really interesting framework. And you illuminated the dynamics between the Hui Aloha Aino Nakane and the Hui Aloha Aino na Wahine. And that issue of when the delegates, are being chosen, and the men wanted 5 and the women said 2. And the men said, well, you don't vote. And the women in the articles are very clear on, we may not have the vote at this point in the public government, but we have equal standing in this setting. We are Hawaiian as you are. We demand the right to be heard. And they got it. I mean, that was women's suffrage 20 years before it happened. It was very dynamic, I thought. There's pieces of it. That issue of that they were ladies. This wasn't the hoi polloi women. This was ladies, and they maintained a certain level of status. I also just want to point out how they treated Kuaihelani Campbell like royalty when she did the main chapter carried so much weight in the political field of patriotism that she was seen as she and Emma, Ima Navahi, are supreme patriots, dedicated to the cause. Anyway, I don't think there's any disappointment in that. This creates a framework for some really, really important study.
Mahalo.
Was there actually an article or a series of articles or a combination of articles that actually does tell that story about how the petitions are sent up on the backs of the people, of the dig in the ground and get your quarter and give that, because that's what's gonna
Yeah.
send this up. You know, I know you can pull it out from in between the lines of different places, but is there something that just says it straight up, like this is it?
Yeah, there's one.
One
I
or
have to go
Okay.
look
two.
for it.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, it clearly says like, even though it's gonna feed you, it's more important. Like the people need your penny more than you need it.
Yeah.
So give it up.
Yeah. Some straight up like calls for funding, and basically that. Yeah. It might feed you for one more day, but your lahui needs it more than you do.
That whole story to me is like the same heart wrenching thing like when you listen to Halilio stuff.
Yeah.
It's right there, the two of them. I don't know. Yeah, life
Yeah.
would suck if you never heard that story. I think, and not knowing that that was there, that would suck even worse.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and that they're fundraising. Like we kind of skipped over the cholera thing, but like at the same time that all this is going on, there was a cholera epidemic. A whole bunch of, like it said, we're, this is a funding drive to provide food for poor and destitute natives, is like, the terminology as we translated it, it's pretty much what it said. And so there's epidemics, there's political, upheaval, there's just so much going on that they're dealing with, so the ladies are like trying to organize on the political level, but they're also just worried about, are these Hawaiians eating, and they're out there asking people to donate money, and they're cooking beef and making poi and holding these huge things where they're feeding hundreds of people who are hungry,
Yeah.
and so that was something that I didn't realize about them until, and it's only, you could like this, we're inferring this from one or two articles that say it, but to me it was like, even though we just got these little points, it indicates to me that there's more of that happening. I think, I don't think that that's the only thing going on of that kind. I think that's the one that made it into the paper, but there's probably 5-10 other events that are similar. And maybe the guys doing it out in the Kuainas, there was one isn't getting printed or whatever, And so I don't want to get romantic and larger than it, it is, but I think they point to larger discussions that are happening. And it's like Kumu said, there's not a lot that's reported. And that's why I started by saying I've never felt so outside of like what was happening. And I really wanted to get in, and I wanted more to sink my teeth into. And it's like, there just wasn't a ton. And so, but the things we got, we did really appreciate. And there are really some really good ones. And we've linked to a lot of those. And so you can check them out.
Probably because I was so busy in keep up, I should have jumped in a little more to. I'm sorry, but there was a series of articles that I had pulled for another thing that we did, where they didn't actually say Hui Aloha Aina, because the story behind the collection of the petitions, how did they actually collect, distribute, and collect the petitions? You guys never came across that?
Well, they did.
Well, there was a couple. Like there was one where a woman was sent to Kauai to go and like actually set up community meetings and stuff, and she had to go around Napali, almost her boat almost swamped. And she
Right.
was like, "Yeah, this book was more important than my life. I needed to make sure that this book was saved with everybody's signatures. Like I could have died as long as this book was okay."
There's a whole story there. There's a couple of articles that I just pulled out. I should have sent them to you guys, but it tells the story of, like, they put the call out just like like it's a talk story, sing songy. We're going on a Huakai. But what that actually is to lay out the plan for what island they'll be on, where they're landing. They're going to stay for 1 week, and then they'll be picked back up and to gather and all that kind of thing. And then the coverage of them in the 1895 Wilcox Rebellion, when they're feeding all the wives and children of
Right,
that's in the
absolutely.
paper too. So it's not, because Poke is right, they couldn't say outright, this is what's happening. Everything was under guise or under, a cloak of
Well, in
secret.
a way, I mean, all of these associations are viewed as insurgents.
Right.
And so, you know, they're being very cautious. The Aima letters are really apparent that way.
Yeah.
Is that, you know, they're very, very secretive almost, but, you know, and yet they're using the newspapers as, you know, a way to share what can be shared, and especially the mechanics of it all gets described in the newspapers. A lot of the
Yeah.
internal, why is there a problem or is there a problem, you know, because confidence was required. And that's why all those articles about Lokai unity is critical, you know.
Yeah, that was a
Let's get through
consistent
this.
message.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
the other thing too is that like we probably should have expanded our search terms to include some of that other stuff. There's a gajillion and billion one things with Aloha Aina in it. And so we tried to stick to mostly the Hui names, but I'm sure that there's a lot that didn't come into our net because we didn't, you know, search under more or different terms.
But you still had more than you could possibly translate. So it's a good window into the field.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like it was reams more, but it was a bit more. And I think there's more out there that we didn't find. So that's also, you know, that's encouraging.
Okay.
Okay. Whew. Good job.
Yeah,
Job
we're
all.
running long.